Welcome to Glasnost in Our Time, where we discuss world politics and especially the ideas behind world politics. Today is April 1st, 2022. It's really April 1st, and this is not a joke, and the rest of the thing won't be a joke, but it is April 1st. It is April 1st. So no jokes today. We want to talk about Hillary Clinton today and her piece in the New York Times Sunday, 27 March. It was about Madeleine Albright. Madeleine Albright was Secretary of State between 1993 and 1997 under Bill Clinton. And Hillary was the Secretary of State under Barack Obama between 2009 and 2013. So this piece that Hillary wrote in the New York Times, it talks about Madeleine Albright, and it more or less endorses Madeleine Albright's views, and it lays down a kind of ideology, I think, about democratic foreign policy. I say the foreign policy of the Democratic Party. It's of interest to us, I think, because Hillary might end up being the nominee of the Democrats, running against Donald Trump in 2024. That's thinkable. So in a way, she is in effect laying down the whole perspective and ideological outlook of the foreign policy of the Democrats going forward. So I think it's of interest to see what her ideas are. And I think, as a matter of fact, it amounts to a kind of ideology. And if you had to put a name on this ideology, I would say it is unrestricted Cold War ideology, unconstructed Cold War ideology. That is to say, it is Cold War that has not been reformed by any of the lessons that were learned since the Vietnam War. So there we are. And I want to take a look at some of the points that she brings up in this tribute to Madeleine Albright and get an idea what this ideology is. So that's really all I want to do today. And it won't take very long. I think it should be 20, 25 minutes. I look forward to your responses about this, because it deals with, I think, important matters of war and peace. So what is this ideology that Hillary is laying down? I would call it then unconstructed Cold War ideology. It's let's quote from one of Hillary's statements about the problem. So talking about Madeleine Albright, she says, as Madeleine often said, her crucial historical frame of reference was Munich. It was Munich, not Vietnam. So she had a deep appreciation of the risks of inaction, the risks of inaction. Today, with a rising tide of authoritarianism threatening democracy, not just in Ukraine, but all over the world, this is a lesson worth remembering. So the main phrase in here is Munich rather than Vietnam. Munich rather than Vietnam. So she's talking about the Treaty of Munich, 1938, that carved up Czechoslovakia. And the reference is fairly straightforward because Madeleine Albright's father, Joseph Korbel, is a Czech. She's a Czech, of course. He taught at University of Colorado for many years, wrote a number of books about East Central Europe, takes pretty much the Czech point of view. The Czechs are virtually the only democratic country throughout the interwar period between World War I and World War II. The Czechs were the only country that ended up as a democracy at the end before they were partitioned in 1938. So all the other countries ended up authoritarian, fascist, pro-fascist, pro-Hitler, pro-Mussolini. Every other country in East Central Europe, mostly the NATO partners today. So they do not have a record of democracy. Only Czechoslovakia was a democracy during that period. The Munich Pact divided Czechoslovakia, broke it up. The Nazis wanted the Sudetenland in the West, and they broke up the rest of Czechoslovakia. They made a Czech state, a Slovak state, such as exists today, and a little state in the Far East called Carpatho-Ukraine or Subcarpathian Ruthenia, which the Nazis encouraged to take up Ukrainian nationalism. So the big sponsors the first big sponsors, you could say, of Ukrainian nationalism during that period were the Nazis, were Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. At any rate, the Munich Pact then. Munich, the lessons of Munich, she thinks, are more important than the lessons of Vietnam. So during the Vietnam War, everyone talked in terms of Munich. Let's not make the mistake that we made at Munich. Now, what was the mistake? What has happened with this Munich idea? And I would suggest that Munich has ended up as a kind of a myth. Munich is fairly complicated because it indicates the attitudes of the British and the French appeasing Hitler for the partition of Czechoslovakia, but it also advocates on the other side a victory for Germany, cutting off a piece of Czechoslovakia, and the Poles are with Germany at that time. The Poles have an alliance with Germany from 1934. They're with Nazi Germany on Nazi Germany's absorption of Austria in 1938. They're with Nazi Germany on this Munich thing. They end up with a little industrial town in the north of Czechoslovakia that they attach to Poland together with Hitler. But they can't go with Hitler in the partition of Poland. So at any rate, Munich is a fairly complicated affair. But in the Cold War, and especially during the Vietnam War, it got boiled down to a fairly simple proposition. Munich meant don't yield to dictators or don't yield to any aggressive power. Or another way of putting that is don't make any changes, don't make any territorial changes that are forced on a smaller opponent. Not a bad rule generally, as a myth goes, but the way it got applied in the Cold War, it ended up as a kind of an argument for give them an inch and they'll take a mile. So if we fear communism, we have to stop it really absolutely everywhere. There's no compromising with communism. No matter what kind of hot water we get into with communism, no matter what kind of a cause communism, what the real politics of communism are. And in this case, with regard to Vietnam, the politics of communism were the liberation and national self-determination of Vietnam. Even whatever the politics are, we have to oppose communism, give them an inch, and they'll take a mile. So the myth of Munich, I think we could call it. A lot of mistakes, a lot of agony, a lot of deaths, a lot of bad American foreign policy ended up being made on the basis of this Munich myth during the Vietnam War. So what is Hillary saying about this? She's saying that Madeleine Albright's lesson was Munich is more important than Vietnam. Munich is more important than Vietnam. In other words, we haven't learned anything from Vietnam. That's important. The important lesson is to go back to the original idea for which we were fighting in 1965 in Vietnam. That is what it amounts to. So there we are with this notion, Munich and not Vietnam. I suppose we did take the lessons of Vietnam. We'd have to go back to the meeting of the wise men. It's just about all the most important foreign policy figures from the period, 1968, this would have been. Where they all came together in Washington and they all reviewed things and they said, this Vietnam War is going nowhere. This was a big mistake to lose all these men to make this effort in Vietnam. We have to start to figure out ways to get out of Vietnam. And that infused the makers of foreign policy for several years in a spirit of what you might call, what was called at that time, solvency. Solvency. We want to preach solvency, said the editors of Foreign Affairs, the leading foreign policy periodical. We want to preach solvency, meaning we want a foreign policy that takes on tasks that are doable, that make sense, that are not too extreme. And we even have to have this attitude toward the communists, even if we don't like the communists. We have to have the attitude that our foreign policy has to be solvent. And what went with this idea is there's nothing wrong with a détente with the communist world. That is to say, a lessening of tensions, and especially a lessening of tensions in the nuclear sphere. So that's what that meant at that time, solvency. The wise men met in 1968, said, better get out of Vietnam. later on, the wisest people, the heavyweights who were determining foreign policy ideas, they said it's time for détente and all the rest of that. With the foreign policy of Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon in the 1970s, this became official policy. So that's what has been dropped, has been pushed aside in favor of a more aggressive line associated with earlier ideas of the Republicans back in the 1940s about rollback. So not containment of communism, but rolling it back, the most aggressive possible line. So that was a line that pretty much started to fall into place in the mid-70s. The Kissinger line was eclipsed, I think. The foreign policy thinker who spoke to that spirit in the brightest tones was Zbigniew Brzezinski. He spoke mainly for Democrats as opposed to Republicans. Kissinger's star faded as a spokesman for Republican foreign policy, although everybody valued his commentary and, of course, his writings. But the ideas of Kissinger and détente, they more or less fell into the background, and everybody wanted this much more lively, aggressive line. The unreconstructed line, you might say, perhaps going back and dropping all of the discussion of the lessons of Vietnam. And you might say, of course, more of an attitude of Munich. We don't want to appease. When the communists are gone, we don't want to appease the people who succeed them. We just don't want to appease. And what does appeasement mean? Any kind of accommodation, just about any kind of accommodation of any other power in the world. And when we say they can't have a sphere of influence, what we're saying is not that there will be no spheres of influence, but that there will only be one sphere of influence, and it will be ours. So no other spheres of influence. Well, Hillary Clinton was not always so stern about that. And when she first took power as Secretary of State with Barack Obama, she tried for a reset. She argued that maybe we should try again with the Russians now. And in my opinion, that made sense. But the reset didn't go. The reset was offered even after the Russians marched into Georgia to stick up for those little statelets of Russians in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. These, of course, will become important things again, because South Ossetia recently declared that it wants to be a Soviet republic now. So there's liable to be more trouble with Georgia dealing with that question. Even after that, Hillary was the first one to say that the Georgians were probably at fault in this squawk with South Ossetia, rather than the Russians and the South Ossetians. Hillary was very straightforward about that. That is actually the way the events unfolded, and Hillary was candid and straightforward about that. So she's not always been such a big proponent of such an aggressive foreign policy. And I think it made sense, this idea of a reset at the time, but it didn't go. And now there we are, we're back to Munich. So there is the position that Hillary stakes out. Second point, she says that NATO is a political political alliance and not just a military pact, That is to say, it is a meeting of political allies, I suppose. Can she say that it's a grouping of democracies? No. I don't think anybody would call Turkey a democracy. Turkey's a big actor in NATO at the moment. So that isn't quite right. But is NATO more than we think it is? It is just not just a military alliance, but is it an alliance of ideologically attuned co-thinkers? Is it that kind of alliance? Well, perhaps. I think it certainly has pretensions along those lines. Those are not necessarily unwholesome. I don't mean to argue against that idea. Nothing wrong with democracies agreeing about democracy, criticizing each other about backslipping when it comes to being less democratic. Criticisms about this or that policy of the Poles, for example, and the Hungarians. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with an attitude of criticism toward anybody. Nothing wrong with this ideology of all the Democrats against all the authoritarians if it's on the field of political criticism and dialogue, even sharp statements. But it does not work as an attitude toward military affairs, matters of war and peace. I don't think this kind of an alliance, if it is pursued with a kind of a thoroughgoing military passion and rigor, is going to lead to anything but trouble in the future. Now, is that an attitude of an appeaser? Sometimes you hear people suggest that to talk that way, it means that you're just following Russian disinformation and you're an appeaser. And that's unfortunate. It's unfortunate that we ended up with this perspective. Okay, so NATO is it has an ideological aspect to it, for sure. That isn't its definition, though. Its definition is a military bloc. It's a military pact. And nothing wrong with making a military alliance if you have something you want and really need to make an alliance against. And everybody thought it was necessary in the days of the Cold War when we were dealing with the Soviet Union. Shouldn't there have been some kind of change when the Soviet Union passed from the scene, when it was partitioned, for goodness sake? Shouldn't there have been some kind of a change in attitude toward NATO? Shouldn't NATO have ended up with a different mission? Should have been rethought? I don't want to say automatically dissolved, but maybe perhaps assigned a new mission or spoken about in a different context. It certainly was a different context when the Cold War ended. The Russians certainly thought so. They thought for years, a good 10 years, maybe more than that. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the Russians thought that they were going to be invited into NATO. So there we are. NATO is a military pact, though. And, in the way it's set up, especially since the failure of the Lisbon Force Goals of 1952, Lisbon Force Goals said that NATO would be actually a pact for defense. They were going to raise troops and meet the Soviets with armies and conduct a defense against the Soviets. They agreed on a large number, 96 divisions or something like that. Huge expenditure on troops. So all the new NATO members, they just joined. They went back and they said, gee, when we made NATO, when we cooked it up in 1949, the United States had a monopoly of nuclear weapons, and there wasn't any other nuclear power. So we knew that, and maybe at bottom, that's the reason for NATO is American nuclear weapons, an American nuclear monopoly, and that will be the protection. It will be deterrence for the protection of the NATO members, if they're worried about the Soviet Union, rather than defense. So we, NATO powers, are not going to raise troops. All we'll have here is a tripwire. Actually, I served myself in these tripwire forces. I was in a tank battalion. I had 5 tanks. I was a platoon leader, young second lieutenant. We went up to the border. I looked through my binoculars at the Soviet positions, and no doubt they were doing the same thing with us. And we all realized that if the balloon went up, as we put it in those days, that is to say, if there was a war, that what would result from that would be essentially an attempt at a nuclear defense of Europe. That's the way we were thinking of it. And we were just tripwires. So they still use this terminology today about NATO, tripwire forces. And all the forces that we've sent into Poland and other East European countries during the present war, those are tripwire forces. In other words, they are supposed to set off a nuclear response by the United States, even to a conventional attack on them. So for all we know, the members of NATO have this idea that if the Russians should start attacking supply lines along which are being sent javelins and NLAWs and Stinger missiles that are killing Russians, the Russians should go to the sources of the supply in these countries, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, and attack them, that the United States would automatically be drawn in. So our tripwire forces are stationed in various places in order to establish this point, reinforcing the tripwire, they've come to call it nowadays. That's a bizarre, weird idea, but it has taken hold as a phrase in the Pentagon, should really be rethought. Serious people in the Pentagon should really rethink this idea. Reinforcing the tripwire. Do we want this tripwire relationship? And what goes with a tripwire relationship of this kind? I think it does give certain countries a blank check, especially the ones that are liable to get into a difficult situation with Russia. They have a guarantee that the United States will stand behind them, according to Article 5 of the NATO treaty. That's a little more complicated than they think, but that's the thought that is conveyed to them. In other words, they are under the impression, and I think many people in Washington are under the impression that we have given a blank check to 30 countries in NATO. So you get involved in some problem, it can be large or small, you throw the first P, the first pebble at Russia, and the United States is obligated to engage Russia to back you up. That has to be rethought. That may have made sense at one time, and I even doubt that, but that's a fundamental problem that has to be rethought. And I don't think one can just talk about a sacred obligation, as Joe Biden has done, with regard to something like that, because this becomes a sacred obligation to wage World War III. And to wage World War III over something that we might not even be involved in. Have somebody else be able to trip the wire that starts World War III. That's got to be rethought. That's a problem with NATO. And one other point with NATO, it's divided. Not everybody thinks the same way in NATO. If the United States seeks to ally all of NATO together, this is not going to take. At present, it looks like there is unity. So strong is the sense of reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine that all of NATO is speaking at the moment with one voice. But under normal circumstances, under peace circumstances, the French and the Germans speak with one voice, and there's another voice in NATO. You might say it's the British, the Poles, maybe the Baltic states, maybe a few others. So there are two voices in NATO under normal circumstances. The British and the Germans have not abandoned the idea that at some point they should have some relationship with Russia. It may be contentious, may be difficult, maybe who knows what it may be, but it's certainly in the national interest of those two countries to contemplate the possibility of uniting all of Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals, as General de Gaulle used to put it in the 1960s. So that is something that continues to be a factor when considering NATO. The idea that NATO is divided. And sometimes it might be thinkable that the United States might agree slightly more with the French and the Germans than with others, such as the Poles in NATO. That's thinkable from the standpoint of US foreign policy. So it's a myth that we are all united as allies, et cetera, that we all ought to act that way so that everybody speaks with one voice. And from the standpoint of US policy, that people who are not Americans get to determine American foreign policy right up to the point of nuclear war. That's got to be rethought. Things are more complicated than Hillary is, and than Joe Biden, I must say, are making it out. So what else does she say in this thing? She says NATO expansion is not a provocation to Russia. No, it's not a provocation to Russia. Just look at the map. Read the documents that have been laid out by Putin. You can't simply dismiss them. They represent the viewpoint of a state with which you have to contend. This is fundamental. It's ABC. You're not an appeaser. You're not a dupe of Russian propaganda. If you say that you are interested to see what the Russians think, especially if they want to act on it, you have to think in these terms. This is fundamental realism. Now, I know that occasionally people don't like realism. In fact, right now, I would say there's even a consensus against realism. But you can't do that. This makes no sense. Makes no sense politically, makes no sense in a world that is armed with nuclear weapons. You cannot be so passionate ideologically that you will make mistakes with regard to nuclear weapons. No. So this is a fundamental thing. And maybe it's a fundamental disagreement that we have with Hillary on this question, because she, on the whole, follows Anne Applebaum. Anne Applebaum says, NATO expansion over the last 30 years has been the greatest thing in the world. Nothing so terrific as NATO expansion. It's the finest hour, she thinks, for NATO. Well, Anne Applebaum is the wife of Radek Sikorski. So he's a former foreign minister. He drinks deep of Polish nationalist ideology. It's the ideology of Marshal Piłsudski in the 1930s. It happens that Marshal Piłsudski was allied with Adolf Hitler, that the Poles and the Germans had an alliance from 1934, right up to the point where the Germans started threatening the Poles. So the ideology that the Poles pursued in those days was, it was something they thought they could do together with the Nazis. That would have involved an attack on the Soviet Union. You know, if we had stood up, and when I say we, I'm not talking about the United States. The United States would not have stood up at NATO, at Munich in 1938. The United States was not part of this. We're talking about British and French policy. But if British and the French had stood up against Hitler in 1938, they would have been against the Poles as much as the Germans. It might have been a war between Britain and France on the one hand and Germany and Poland on the other. History is more complicated than a lot of simplistic spokespeople would make out. Well, at any rate, I think some people might say that the argument I'm making, or the argument that some people are making these days, and in my opinion, they're some of the brightest people around. I mean, I could reel off a whole string of names of notables in foreign policy. You know, some people say that this is an argument for appeasement. But I think this is all wrong. And what we need is much more prudence and a sophisticated reasoning when it comes to these serious matters of war and peace. And I guess there we are. And I guess the last point that I should bring up is the fact that the way this thing is shaping up politically is very difficult, because a lot of us are absolutely rooted in our bones against the spirit of those events that took place January 6th, 2021, the Trump putsch, an attempt to actually reverse the results of a democratic election in the United States by an armed crowd. Well, excuse me, not an armed crowd, by a crowd that attacked the Capitol. That's a putsch. That's a coup d'etat. That's an attempt to seize power. That's a big, big step. That portends a neo-fascist tendency in the United States. Insofar as Donald Trump is the demiurge of that whole thing, and I believe he is, we have to oppose that root and branch. We're all against that. The way things are shaping up, though, with this war in the Ukraine, if you oppose Trump, Trump is liable to say that he wants a more realistic attitude toward Russia, and he thinks the Biden presidency did not take up the opportunities to prevent this war. Gee, they'll have a point there. And what Hillary is saying is that her struggle, her ideological struggle of the simplest sort, democracy against fascism, is in the United States, it's a struggle against Trump and the right wing of the Republican Party, or really the Republican Party these days. So there we are. We're in the position now of giving realism, a realist critique of the policies of the American government vis-a-vis European affairs. We're in a position of giving those a, how to put it, giving those up to Trump and allowing someone like Tucker Carlson or Donald Trump be the realist in this conversation. And the only way we can oppose him is by being more passionate, more earnest, more warlike, is what it comes to. A really bad situation we've got ourselves in. It's a difficult position. And you know, I'm terribly sorry to have engaged you in this discussion at length, such a long time, without giving you a rousing slogan at the end. And in fact, I'm doing the opposite. What I'm saying is that everybody needs to slow down, to be much less aggressive, to look at those forces in NATO who are arguing for peace. And these are even some Poles. You know, in polls, the Poles don't necessarily have to have an aggressive, hostile position to Russia. There is a positivist tradition in Polish foreign policy with which we could make common cause. To those voices. So all I'm advocating is a recognition of the complexity of these things and a rejection, I have to say, of what Hillary Clinton has to say about Madeleine Albright, and in effect, what both of them have to say. Very simplistic foreign policy line, and in my opinion, a very confused one as well. So that is my message, and I'm not just issuing this tepid message, I'm actually saying that we ought to fight for it. We ought to fight for this moderation. There ought to be a struggle for peace in the United States. There should be demonstrations right now against the position that holds that we have to have a long war. This is the position that they have all come to in the Democratic Party. We have to have a long war in order to remove Putin from power in Ukraine. Excuse me, I didn't put that well. Let me try that again. A long war in Ukraine with the aim of removing Putin from power. This line is misbegotten. We have to marshal all our efforts. We have to demonstrate against the long war and against peace, or excuse me, for peace. So if I've put that in a way that is intelligible and that is not entirely certain, I hope that you'll accept this as a thought to be pondered. Thank you.